Hi, good morning, Guy. It's Diane. I'm the committee officer for the Housing Committee. Just to check that, could you turn...
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow the @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #LondonHousing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. The main item on the agenda today is an investigation into exempt and supported housing in London. However, we have some short items of business first, so can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on today's agenda? Okay. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of October 2022? And can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Can we note the action taken by myself as chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's affordable housing monitor as attached at Appendix 1? Great. And so that brings us to our main item of business today, which is a discussion on exempt and supported housing in London. Can I welcome our guests to the chamber? So welcome to Jasmine Bazran, who's Head of Policy and Campaigns at Crisis, and Tom Copley, Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development. And we have some guests joining us remotely. I think Sharon will be joining us shortly. We will have us joining us Councillor Sharon Thompson, who is the Cabinet Member for Housing and Homelessness at Birmingham City Council, and Guy Chaundi, Senior Manager for Housing Strategy, also at Birmingham City Council. And joining us virtually as well is Bob Blackman for Harrow East, who's MP for Harrow East, my apologies. And as many of you know, he's also a former Assembly member who might be joining us slightly late as well. So to set the context for today's discussion, I'd like to note that the London Assembly meeting last Thursday voted unanimously to pass a motion on exempt accommodation, which included the Assembly's support for Crisis's Regulate the Rogues campaign and called on government to continue its support for the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Bill as it progresses through Parliament, and to urgently regulate providers in England and end the scandal unfolding in exempt accommodation. So I will start with the first questions, and they're to you, Tom. So what research has the GLA conducted into need for supported housing across London, and to what extent is that need met?
Thank you very much, Chair. This is a very important subject, and I think an increasingly growing one, particularly if you consider London's ageing population. And it's worth, first of all, just considering the very, very wide range of different types of accommodation and different client groups that require specialist and supported housing. So, of course, there's housing for older people, there's gypsy and traveller sites, there's housing needed for care leavers, for people living with different kinds of disabilities, military veterans, people leaving prison, rough sleepers, and many, many others. So it's very, very important that across London we have a range of provision. And in terms of what the GLA is doing, and we of course have the Mayor's funding programmes, but I'm happy to come to those later because I don't think that's the subject of this particular question. In terms of the assessments that the GLA does, first of all, the policy context. So policy H12 of the London Plan requires the boroughs to assess short-term, medium and permanent need for specialist and supported housing within their boroughs. But on a London-wide level, there are three key ways that the GLA collects and analyses and provides data on the need for specialist and supported housing. First of all, within the London plan itself, there are benchmarks for specialist housing for older Londoners. So they're contained within the London plan itself. You will know that the Mayor has also committed, and of course, I believe as a planning authority, the Greater London Authority is legally required to produce an accommodation needs assessment for gypsies and travellers in London. This will be the first pan-London assessment of the needs of gypsies and travellers in London, I think, conducted since 2007 or 2008. So very, very important. And I believe there is a live survey currently. I think it's still active. I have tweeted about it. I'm not sure if it's closed yet. I think it's still open. And that is actually seeking the views of people that work with gypsies and travellers themselves, gypsies, Roma and travellers themselves, which will feed in to that. And then the final major piece of research that the GLA does to support the needs assessment for specialist and supported housing in London is the assessment that we do under Part 4 of the GLA's duties under the Domestic Abuse Act for accommodation-based support for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. Those are the three key sort of data collection and assessments that we do regarding the need for the need for specialist and supported housing in London.
You've kind of answered my second question a little bit already, but once that data is collected, once boroughs have identified the need for support and which, if you like, groups of need exist, what do you do with the data? I know that MOPAC commissions housing as part of their domestic, well, via you, I suppose, via the housing residential team, supported housing.
So the data is used to inform boroughs and indeed the GLA about what kinds of housing is required and what services are commissioned. So in terms of the work that's done regarding older Londoners, within the London plan, there are benchmarks there so that boroughs know roughly what the sort of assessed need for specialist provision for older Londoners is within their boroughs. The Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Needs Survey will tell us what the requirement is for pictures for gypsies and travellers are around London. And the needs survey for victims of domestic abuse will inform us and MOPAC, who, of course, we have a shared services arrangement with MOPAC, as you know, regarding this, what kinds and levels of accommodation are required. I should note, however, of course, it's one thing to have the needs survey, and it's very important that we have the data. But of course, what's essential is that funding follows that, and I'm sure you'll have some questions later on, regarding ways in which the Mayor and the GLA funds specialist and supported housing. But what the data does is tells us, essentially what the needs are. And then if we've got the funding, we're able to direct it in the most strategic way possible.
Okay. And so just those two examples that you gave of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities and older Londoners, boroughs and London as a whole are struggling to provide for to meet that assessed need. Mm-hmm. So we know that there is that need, but it's not being met. How are you pushing boroughs to make sure that they do comply with that because that's a requirement that they look at that, but is there a requirement to then provide what has been identified? So just really quickly, it's not, no, it's okay. I'm just thinking out loud. It's not necessarily specifically for those two groups, but just as an example, if there is need identified and it's not being met, what more are we doing? What more is the GLA doing to make sure that it is, or incentivising people to meet that need?
I think the key way that we can incentivise need to be met is through the funding streams that we have. But I say the same thing that I would say to you when we discuss sort of affordable housing more broadly. We have a very large assessed need, But the budget that we're given by the government in order to try and meet that need is far from sufficient. And we have a number of programmes related to specialist and supported housing that have delivered some excellent results, but still, not at the levels that would match the assessed needs. So there's the Mayor's Care and Specialist and Supported Housing Fund. We fund Gypsies and Traveller Pictures. There's a Homelessness Change and Platform for Life. There's the Move On programme. There's a rough sleeping accommodation programme. There's a community housing fund, which falls into specialist housing. They're not necessarily supported housing. And we will soon be taking on a new funding programme, SHAP, for rough sleepers as well. So I think the key way that we can incentivise boroughs is using the funding levers that we have. And in terms of what boroughs wish to bid for from our programmes, they will be informed by the needs assessment that they have made, or indeed that we have made.
And so we've had the opportunity to speak to some boroughs, and also some have responded to our call for evidence. And they've told the committee that there are challenges in assessing the level of need for supported housing because of the resources involved, and because people can be placed out of borough. So how is the GLA supporting boroughs to assess the need for supported housing?
I think I've given you the three key metrics that make the most sense on a pan-London level. I think once you start, I think those are the three groups where it makes sense to do, and it's most valuable to do pan-London needs assessment. I think for many other groups, we can't calculate that need just using pan-London quantitative demographic data, and it requires much more detailed information about the profile of local populations, and that's the kind of data that's held by local authorities. I appreciate that local authorities and local authority planning departments are, well, cut to the bone, if not beyond, after many years of austerity, unfortunately, and that makes it more difficult for them to make those assessments of need. But we have to think about where the GLA is best placed to assess need. And if you take older Londoners, for example, where across London, there are, every borough has a significant population of older Londoners. That's not necessarily the case with all groups. And in order to get a sort of a useful assessment of what the need is, you really need that local granular information, and that needs to come from boroughs.
Thank you. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor, and Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you too, Assembly Member Devenish.
Always a pleasure, particularly when you're on this side of the table, which I think some of my colleagues will come back to later. But my question to you, in 2016, a great year than when we joined together, the Housing Committee, of which you were Deputy Chair at the time, recommended a pan-London map of supported housing stock and provision. Do you still support this recommendation now that you have elevated yourself to Deputy Mayor? And if yes, when can we expect to see one, please? Maybe it could be our New Year's present.
I must confess, Assembly Member Devenish, that had escaped my mind, but I am very grateful to you for bringing it to my attention, and I will have to go back and refresh my memory about that recommendation. I do like data visualization. I do like maps. These things are things that I like. We'll have to have a look at it. I don't know whether this is something that that might be the new all singing, all dancing London data hub might be able to assist with. But let me speak to our team, have a look at the recommendation, and I'll come back to you.
Thank you. You talked about travellers earlier. At previous meetings, you've talked about particularly trying to find a small site for travellers. Any progress with that you can share with us? Continuing
discussions, in fact, with London Borough of Hackney, one of the chair's boroughs. There was a site there that we were very, very hopeful could be used as a Gypsum traveller site. Unfortunately, some air quality data came back suggesting that it was not appropriate. But I'm continuing to have discussions. I was up in Hackney the other day, spoke to the Mayor of Hackney about this. There is still, I believe, progressing a Gypsy and Traveller site in London Borough of Lewisham, very close to where I live, which I'm very pleased about. And I know of one other London borough that is looking to designate a piece of land for a Gypsy and Traveller site, but I'm not sure that's public yet, so I'm not going to reveal which borough it is.
Okay,
but it is something it is something I continue to be very passionate about, Tony. And sorry, I remember Devonish. And it is
Tony.
It is something I'm really, really determined to get over the line. At some point during my tenure, I think it's really, really important that we support this community.
Is that a commitment from the Mayor's deputy that your tenure could end in only a year and a bit? So by the end of this term, you will actually get Gypsy and Travellers. I'll leave it there on that one.
I think getting one completed might be a tall order.
I'd just be happy if you actually started a project, but we won't go into that. My next question: what are the challenges for? Yeah, please do.
Before you move on to talking about a different area, obviously quite a few of us on this side of the table were on the Housing Committee in 2016 with you, and we also heard from a number of members of the G15 who were saying how difficult it was to remain in the sector. If you do manage to sort out this sort of pan-London stock assessment, would it be possible to ask whether there's been a change and a decrease, as I think there's quite likely to be from what they were saying back in 2016-17, in the amount of supported accommodation that is provided across London? I mean, I think, the situation is that a lot of the G15 members used to have substantial supported housing stock that they quite often worked in conjunction with St Mungo's or Look Ahead or specialist providers, but it does seem as if they have been exiting the sector. So we thought it was difficult when we were all on this committee in 2016, but I think the committee now is worried that it's even more difficult now than it was then, although need has obviously not gone down. Would you be able to do that?
I think that data is probably already publicly available, because I believe I have a figure somewhere for example, how many units of supported housing for older people there are owned by or managed by housing associations, and I presume if I have that number, it's available on an annual basis. So shall I...
I think what we're really interested in is, I think the figures probably for older persons' accommodation are more available, and the same for domestic abuse, but it's looking at the amount of accommodation that there is for people who, are coming straight from the streets, perhaps because they've been rough sleeping before but are now being homed, people who've previously had drug and alcohol problems, people who've got low-level mental health needs, young people leaving care who are then moving on from care-related accommodation into independent accommodation. There's quite a wide range of supported housing needs that don't fall into the older person's category.
I'll discuss this with our data people. It might just be something that we can actually impose on the G15 to provide to us on an annual basis, and just say, look, tell us how many you've got, if it's not already publicly available. But let me do some investigating outside of this meeting.
I think that would be a very small requirement if people are looking for grant myself. But thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Back to you.
Thank you. And can we add former prisoners to that list as well?
Yes.
Deputy
Yes,
Mayor?
Absolutely.
Former prisoners, veterans. I mean, actually, it's quite a long list. Maybe we should compile it properly rather than out of the top of our heads, and then we'll send that to you.
Yeah. So my next question, Deputy Mayor, what are the challenges for providers of supported housing in London in terms of delivering new homes? Building on AM Cooper's question, really. What is the GLA doing to help overcome these challenges? And in terms of stats, for the AHP of 21-26, you've allocated funding for 325 supported homes. Given the challenges we're talking about, what has enabled you to secure these homes, and are you able to secure more, please?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. I think, I guess that the challenges will speak to some degree to the point about the programme. So I think, first of all, and I've discussed this at previous Housing Committee meetings, there's the need for revenue support. So Through the Affordable Homes Programme, we can provide capital funding, but we can't provide any revenue funding. There are no revenue streams provided by the government attached to homes that we fund through the Affordable Homes Programme. So that's the first thing. So number one, providers need to be able to pay for the support element as well as the actual buildings themselves. Then secondly, in relation to the buildings themselves, they tend to be more expensive to build. So specialist and supported housing schemes, on average, each unit's 20% more expensive to construct than general needs housing. And that's generally because of a need for higher spec, because of the higher support needs, and often for communal spaces as well, which obviously takes out space for additional units. They're generally lower density. So in terms of competing for land, it's much more difficult for specialist and supported housing to compete for land versus other types of housing. And I think probably the last sort of challenge that I would give would be that there can be local opposition to certain types of specialist and supported housing due sometimes to the particular client groups and perceptions of the particular client groups amongst local communities, which makes it difficult to get through. I also think in relation, just going back to the point about resourcing within planning departments, I think there's probably a lack of knowledge and expertise within a lot of borough planning departments about specialist and supported housing itself. Now, in terms of the other part of your question about how the GLA is working to sort of overcome these, this is something that's really gone up our agenda recently. Between our policy team and our specialist and supported housing team within the Housing and Land Directorate, a lot of work's taking place at the moment, some quite intensive work looking at how we can increase that number that you quoted of the number of units that we've allocated within the 21-26 programme. So earlier this year, there was a review conducted by the two teams which looked to uncover key challenges, which I've already set out. They met with, I think, 25 external stakeholders, which included, councils, NHS, housing associations, etc. And last week, a sort of summit was held with providers looking at the challenges around specialist and supported housing. One thing, so there's a few things that we intend to do to increase delivery. Firstly, we're looking at developing a sort of vision document, which will set out a sort of strategic vision for specialist and supported housing in London. We're looking at the policy levers that we have. For example, whether or not there are other things that we can do via planning policy or planning guidance to encourage take-up of specialist and supported housing. Looking at whether or not we can produce some design guides, and the London the GLA planning team have produced all sorts of wonderful planning guidance documents. Perhaps we could look at producing some guidance. Looking at how we can increase our convening role, which I think we've already been doing, but what more we can do. And finally, lobbying government as well around some of the issues that we need nationally. Perhaps a national strategy for specialist and supported housing, and indeed revenue funding. Sorry, I'll stop there. I realise I've been talking for quite a while.
That's all very well, Deputy Mayor, but is there a particular flagship project you can point to and say, this is what we want to replicate? And can you provide any notes in terms of the summit to the committee last week, please?
I'm sure I can. I'll make a note that if there, I presume a note was produced. I presume there's no state secrets in it. So I'm sure we could circulate the note from the committee. In terms of flagship policies, I visited a fantastic scheme. This is actually going back a little way now, but the Charlie Ratchford Centre in Camden, which I know well because it was in the ward I stood for unsuccessfully for the council many years ago. It's been completely rebuilt as part of a new development funded by the Care and Specialist and Supported Housing Fund. It's an absolutely fantastic development. One of the things I like about it as well is it's pet friendly. So the older residents who are there are allowed to keep pets. I also saw recently, and I thought this was a really good scheme. As you probably know, there's a lot of older persons housing that was built sort of in the 80s and 90s, which is now no longer fit for purpose, kind of the old style sheltered accommodation. Through our rough sleeping accommodation programme, we funded the refurbishment of a closed down older persons
Deputy Mayor,
centre.
if I could just interrupt you.
Yeah.
So the scope of our inquiry and looking at the supported and exempt accommodation, I think it'd be helpful to us if you were to talk about, in addition to the work that you've done around older people's housing, the other types of accommodation that perhaps aren't quite.
Yes, I was just coming to that. Sorry. So this was it was a closed down, obsolete older persons residential home. Through our rough sleeping accommodation programme, it's now, I think, 22, maybe more, units for former rough sleepers who are coming off the streets and into longer term, coming out of the hotels and into longer term accommodation. So I think that's a great example of innovation, because we've taken essentially what was an obsolete place for older people and turned it into something, a fantastic place for people to take their sort of first steps, having come off the streets as rough sleepers, before then moving on into long-term accommodation. So I would cite that. That's a Waltham Forest Council scheme.
Thank you. My final question, and I shall let others have a go. We always talk about Transport for London owning more land than any other public body in London. We always quote the 16 Hyde Parks or the size of the London Borough of Camden. Have you managed to prize off them at least one site that you can accelerate this wonderful, worthy work we're talking about here?
I can give you not one but two. There are two Transport for London sites which they have committed to dispose of to London CLT as community-led housing, Cable Street and Christchurch Road.
He's answered a question. I'm shocked. Thank you very much,
I've answered quite a few, Tony.
I can't criticise that final answer anyway. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Boff.
Mr. Copley, wasn't there a target for 3,500 supported homes in the 2016-23 affordable housing programme?
So we originally had a target of 10% agreed with DLUC. Because of the lack of revenue support, the interest from the market just wasn't there to bid for that level. We now have a sort of an ambition agreed with DLUC currently of 5 to 10%. The reason why we're doing this intensive work that I just set out to Assemblymember Devonish is precisely to drive up that figure. But one of the key reasons is this lack of revenue support. Ultimately, we can pay for the buildings, but if the provider can't provide the funding for the services themselves, it's not going to be much good as supported housing.
Bearing in mind the amount of time it takes to build buildings, don't you think you should start building them now and then solve the revenue support problem afterwards?
Providers can't take that risk. I mean, we in theory we could do that, but then they could just end up going over to general needs housing, and that's not really meeting the need, the specialist need, is it?
And how much have you underspent the affordable housing programme for so far?
There are no underspends.
Over $500 million
unallocated.
There
are no underspends in our affordable homes programme. We're going to use all of it to deliver affordable homes for Londoners.
Over $500 million has been unallocated, is that right?
We don't give a running commentary on what the level of funding is.
Are you going to tell me that I'm wrong in saying that?
As I've said,
are you going to tell me that I'm wrong in saying
I couldn't. Well, as I've said at this committee before, every single day the funding that we've allocated will change as more projects come into the programme.
So am I wrong in saying it's over $500 million?
Yes, you are wrong in saying it's over $500 million.
So what is it closer to?
As I say, we can't give a running commentary because that would be market shaping. If we start giving running,
is it under £500 million?
If we start giving running commentaries on what the figure is, it is market shaping. It makes it harder for us to achieve value for money for the taxpayer.
Is it under £500 million? Then?
We're not giving a running commentary.
We know it's
and
over
we're
£500
also
million. Okay. So how much are you going to supported homes will be delivered from 2021-26 affordable housing programme?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How many supported homes will be delivered from the 2021-2023 affordable housing programme?
Well, as I say, we have an ambition for 5 to 10%. It will the final figure will depend on the interest of partners, whether or not we can get partners interested, whether or not we can get revenue support in. We can't force our delivery partners to deliver homes that they ultimately can't pay for the revenue support of.
You haven't got a number.
I'm saying we've got an ambition of 5 to 10%.
5 to 10%, which is how many homes?
Well, you can calculate it, Assembly Member Boff, I'm sure.
5 to 10%. Well, I'm sure you can.
Well,
That's what you're paid to do.
You know,
what is that figure?
It would be up to 3,500, I suppose, at the high end.
Up to 3,500.
But
Thank you very much.
as I say, you know, we can't force providers to deliver homes that they then ultimately can't pay for the revenue support for. We're doing as I set out to Assembly Member Devonish, you know, we're doing an awful lot of intensive work with our providers to try and lead the horse to water.
I'm sure that's all good.
But we also need cooperation from the government
we have the
to
figure
actually
of
provide
3,500
the revenue support that we need. And, you know, as I say, they need to be able to provide the supported element as well as the housing element.
Do you ever wonder why these housing committees go on for so long, Assembly Member Copley? Of course you aren't. But going back to that history, the previous answer you gave to Assembly Member Devonish was that you're going to go and look at the recommendation that the committee had when you were vice chairman. I remember it well. I was chairman, you were vice chairman. Recommendation number 1. It's not a long piece of text. It's not like pages and pages that you want to go away and review. It simply said the Mayor should develop a clearer pan-London map of supported housing stock and provision. Do you agree with that? Or has
I'm very happy to look at it and whether or not
you don't need to
it's
look
still,
at it.
you know,
That's
it's
it. The recommendation.
It's 6 years later. I'm very happy. No, Assembly Member Boff, I'm very happy to look at it. Very happy to look at it.
So you think the Mayor shouldn't develop a clearer pan-London map of supported housing stock?
I'm not saying he shouldn't. I'm saying that we're very happy to look at it, Assembly Member Boff.
Well, we've looked at it. You looked at it at the time.
I'm going to have to refresh my memory.
Now,
this was
whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea.
This was 6 years ago. I'm going to have to refresh my memory of that report and the reasoning behind it, and get back to you. And I'm very happy to do that.
Can I just quickly?
And now you're in a different job.
Pause.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Can I just, if we can try to keep to the current inquiry that we have. Obviously, there are the historical, not so historical, recommendations and reports that were produced, and we will make reference to them. But it's really important, I think, that we look at within the scope of what we're looking at now in the current day, rather than rehash previous arguments, if that's okay. I'm going to move to Assembly Member Cooper, and then I will have one question before we move on to the next section.
Just very briefly, and I'm also very interested in spend or underspend on the approved housing programme, but that's also not really the topic of what we're looking at. What I would like to know is you've made several references to the need for the revenue support to come in. And obviously, as I referred in my previous remarks, some of the G15 have been decommissioning supported housing because of the revenue funding issues. Have you done any sort of assessment at GLA level, or has the G15 or possibly even local authorities done any assessment of the level of revenue that we would need to achieve the 5 or 10% of new accommodation? Do we know what that figure might look like?
It's a very good question, Assembly Member Cooper. I suspect we would have to different kinds of supported housing have different levels of revenue support, some more intensive than others. I think that's actually a very good question for me to go back to the team and get them to sort of to have a think about, because then we might be able to, I think that's not a bad suggestion. But as I say, we'd have to make some assumptions about the kind of balance of what we would be funding.
Sure, I think we'd really appreciate that, and I think the knock-on savings for example, the National Health Service, one of the points that was made very powerfully by some of the boroughs who came in to talk to us was that the lack of support for people who aren't sort of, suffering from a major mental health crisis, but have got sort of low levels of support needs because of, perhaps a more manageable mental health situation, but then they end up in a crisis because they're not even getting that low level of support. And so it would be really useful, I think, for our investigation if you were able to supply some information about that.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
And what we do have, of course, is the information on the revenue, for example, on the rough sleeping accommodation programme. And actually, this is a really good example of why revenue is so important, because that has been very successful, and we've got, I've probably got the figure here. I've got the figures here, but 2021-22, we had 727 starts under the rough sleeping accommodation programme, and the reason why it's so attractive is because we have that revenue support. So.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I just actually have a couple, and I promise we will have questions for you, Jasmine. Apologies. So there's a requirement in the London Plan, Tom, for boroughs to undertake a needs assessment for supported housing. Mm-hmm. And again, just going back to the point about in the widest sense for the purposes of this, does the GLA analyse these needs assessments to understand need for supported housing across London? And are these needs assessments shared with your supported and specialist housing teams?
So yes, our supported and specialist housing team, would be have done a lot of desk-based research recently, and would be looking at the information that's out there from boroughs. So yes.
Before we move on to the next section, I just wanted to say welcome. We have some guests today. Some Year 9 students from Jamiatul Ummah School in Tower Hamlets. So welcome while you take your seats. And the next question is from Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I have one more question for Deputy Mayor, and then, yes, we have some questions for Jasmine. Deputy Mayor, what work has the GLA done to understand the quality of exempt accommodation in London, both the exempt accommodation that GLA commissions and those it does not?
So where we provide, where we commission, where we provide funding for special and supported housing, of course, we have quality control, and indeed where we're providing revenue support, we have some, quite intensive ongoing relationships with providers to make sure that the funding is being used properly, that any issues are being dealt with. So in terms of the stuff that we're funding, we have those quality control mechanisms in place. I would say, beyond that, the GLA's role is not as a regulator, and various different kinds of specialist and supported housing are regulated in different ways. Obviously, you've got the social housing regulator, but some specialist and supported housing won't even fall under that purview. So, in terms of what we're funding and the services that we commission, we're keeping a very, close watch to make sure that it's being delivered properly, that it's of a high quality, that it's decent. But more broadly, we're not a regulator, so we don't have that function, and we don't have the ability to sort of take a view of the stock more broadly.
Thank you. Yeah, that's understood. Obviously, yeah, you're not the regulator, but we certainly heard from a variety of stakeholders across London concerns about the quality of non-commissioned exempt accommodation.
Yeah.
Is there a role that the GLA could play by establishing minimum standards, by a charter or something like that, just as there's no one sort of operating in that space by the looks of it at the moment?
I do think this is one where we simply don't have the powers or the teeth to do that. So this is where we need the government to regulate the sector properly. And I know you've got questions coming up later looking at exempt accommodation. And I know we've got, I think, Bob Blackman on the panel virtually, who is bringing in a private members bill, which is looking to tighten up the regulation in this space, which I think is very, very welcome. And I know you'll have questions on that later on. I do think this is an area where, you know, again, as with the social housing regulation bill. So if we take that as an example, you know, the GLA is not a regulator, but in terms of what we're funding, we brought in new requirements around management and standards, which should hopefully make sure that the stuff that we're funding is managed properly, but also should have a ripple effect as well, because if regulatory judgments are made against a particular provider, we have a set of steps that we can take to withhold funding for new homes. So there is an incentive there that we can create for providers to behave properly. But in terms of having a kind of enforcement power, that's not something that we have.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I did say that not as a regulator, but obviously, yes, we will come to the bill and improved regulation later on. But that feels like you're putting all your eggs in one basket. That will go forward. But is there not a role that the GLA can play without being a regulator in terms of the standards? Because there just seems to be nothing at the moment.
So I think it's what I've set out. I think it's using our funding levers. I think that's the key way. And so, as I say, recently we brought in requirements around management and standards, which should not only affect the new stock that's being built that we're funding, but should have a impact on behaviour that goes beyond that. And I think that's the key way that we can make an impact.
I don't feel that the stakeholders we spoke to felt that there was any sort of ripple effect, that there was a real gap between commissioned and non-commissioned. But
it's certainly early days yet, because we've only just brought these in September, I think. But if there's any, so from your conversations, if there's any sort of suggestions that are practical, that within the powers of the GLA that we are resourced to do, I can look at them.
Okay. We may have some suggestions. Jasmine, I'm not going to ask that, but can I ask what work Crisis has done to understand the quality of exempt accommodation nationally and in London?
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so the quality of exempt accommodation is something we've been quite concerned about for some time, because it came through our frontline services. A real issue with this is that there's a significant paucity of data of the quality of exempt accommodation. So what we know is what our services are reporting back to us in terms of some of the experiences our clients are having to face. And I'm sad to report that kind of ranges from bullying, intimidation, all the way through to kind of sexual abuse. So some of the worst kind of conditions and situations imaginable that people are being forced into, people who are often vulnerable themselves. There isn't a national picture of what that looks like, and that's one of the issues we have. But when we became alert to the issue, we submitted an FOI last year to the DWP to try to obtain as much information as possible on this. And what we learnt was that we could get numbers for the scale of households in exempt accommodation across Great Britain, which is what we had. And there were some concerns about the data collection from local authorities behind that. But the figures did show a significant growth. So although we can't say these are the exact numbers of exempt accommodation, we can probably say that accurately there's been kind of a significant growth in this type of accommodation. And anecdotally, we are hearing from areas that this growth is continuing, and I'm sure Councillor Thompson would be able to speak a bit more to that in Birmingham. The problem with that data, though, is that it doesn't tell us the quality of the accommodation, so we can't separate that out. And we know there are a lot of very, very good providers in this space who are operating as intended, who are providing very high quality accommodation and support, often highly specialised support. So we heard earlier a lot around kind of supported accommodation for older people, for veterans. We know there's excellent provision out there, but in terms of raw data, that's simply not something that is captured anywhere.
Thank you. And you said that obviously, yeah, the quality, you don't really have like quantitative data on that, but you said that you, obviously from your frontline services, you hear things. What sort of issues with the accommodation and the support do you hear?
So with the accommodation, we often hear that it's very poor quality, so people living in very cramped conditions. One of our clients shared how his accommodation was absolutely riddled with mould, to the extent that he had mushrooms growing out the walls. And it's obviously something that he had repeatedly spoken about and hadn't got any support for. So the actual accommodation itself, we hear it can be completely unfit for habitation, to be frank. And then the support, we have heard of examples where it's non-existent. So people are in this accommodation because they do qualify for support and they just aren't receiving that. So we've heard examples of actually, we've heard examples where we think the kind of provider involved in this are linked to a criminal organisation. So the support that's being delivered is locking people in their rooms until they pay service charges, having security guards to prevent them from leaving. We've heard examples where there's prostitution, criminal organisations being involved. So that's the absolute worst end. And I'd like to also read out a quote from one of our clients, Richard, who, when he moved into exempt accommodation, he was told by the provider he would receive support to meet his needs and particularly to look for more permanent accommodation, so as a transitional period for him. And he said that instead there was no support at all. They came out to the house to collect the service charge money. They were useless. I hardly used to come out of my room. The place was disgusting. Even the roof was falling in. It had a bad impact on my mental health. I was even crying myself to sleep at night. It was that bad. And these are the kinds of things that we were hearing through our frontline services. And then in the worst case, as I mentioned, we have heard examples of sexual abuse from the landlords and people who are supposedly providing support.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It really is a dire situation for some of the people that most in need. Do you think that they're and this might sound a bit weird at the moment, but do you think there's an assumption out there that there is not a problem with road providers and exempt accommodation? Because obviously it seems perfectly obvious that you're hearing a lot that there are. Well, you said criminal, so rogue seems a mild word, but do you feel that people in decision-making powers have that understanding of how bad some of the providers are?
I do feel in recent times this has really gotten national attention and there is a lot more understanding on this. Last year, after we submitted the FOI, we also helped shape an APPG for ending homelessness meeting specifically on this topic. And the issue was surfaced there and there was a call, including from Crisis, for the Levelling Up Community Housing and Community Select Committee to conduct an inquiry into this issue, which they did, and have published that report, which I believe they've said included some of the most shocking examples they've ever seen in terms of their inquiries. We did also see last year the then Minister well, I think it was 2020 actually, sorry, the then Minister Eddie Hughes commit to looking in this area, and the government had set up working groups. So there was increasing recognition of this problem. I think one of the main issues was time. So we have had constructive working groups. But for example, one of the key things in this space that we know is needed is regulation and powers for enforcement for local authorities. And the government committed to doing that when parliamentary time allowed, which isn't an incredibly hopeful prospect. But that's one of the reasons we were very pleased when Bob Blackman decided that he would use his private members bill to tackle this issue, having heard about it through the select committee inquiry, and then that we were able to support to shape this, because it is directly affecting so many people we work with.
Can I just quickly clarify something? So the point that you made about it being not a problem that Assembly Member Baker asked, are you talking in general terms about England and Wales, or about London specifically?
Sorry, I was actually just talking about England.
Okay, and so in terms of London specifically, what's your perspective on that same question?
So with London specifically, we are aware there are issues, again, through our frontline services in Brent and Croydon. And the FOI data did show that some of the areas that had the highest kind of levels of growth of exempt accommodation were in London boroughs. In terms of the kind of issues in depth of quality, I would say the area that's got the most attention on this has been Birmingham, and there's been a lot of reporting and investigation in Birmingham, but we know it is in many more places than Birmingham, and one of those is London. So I do think there needs to be more investigation into that, and that's why we really welcome this inquiry.
I think we're going to have to jiggle the questions around, Chair, aren't we? So I'll come back to you, Jasmine.
Yes, so just to say to those of you that have joined, we have a Member of Parliament joining us today, Bob Blackman, and he can only stay for a while. So I'll hand over to Assembly Member Boff.
Mr. Blackman, welcome. What have you heard from your constituents or other organisations about the quality of exempt accommodation in London?
Well, thank you, Mr. Boff. And I think the reality is that in terms of my constituents, we have a very small supply of this type of supported housing. The reason why I'm heavily involved in this is I've served on, as Jasmine calls it, the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee, or its equivalent, since I was elected to Parliament in May 2010. And we embarked on an investigation following advice from Crisis and others that this form of housing, supported housing exempt accommodation, was a complete Wild West show. I have to say, all of us, some of us have served on the committee for a long time, others for short periods of time, but all of us were incredibly shocked by the conditions and the evidence we received from people literally all over the country. As Jasmine said, it's predominantly from Birmingham, where there's been a lot of publicity, and I know you've got Sharon Thompson as a witness to give you details. So I won't steal her thunder in terms of what's going on in Birmingham. Suffice it to say that the committee spent a day in Birmingham and heard from both people who are victims, literally, of rogue landlords, saw at first hand properties that have been used for this purpose, and indeed they heard from residents in the areas affected by the unlicensed process that goes on in Birmingham and across the country. Now, I was shocked when because one of the issues here in Birmingham is that unscrupulous people are buying up perfectly good family houses, using every bit of permitted development, and then turning them in from a 2 or 3 bedroom house into an 8 bedroom house, because it's exempt accommodation. There's no rules over HMOs. There's no rules on licensing. If they've used the measures, they will just provide a small bathroom and a small kitchen, and then they charge enhanced housing benefit because it's exempt, which can lead to, and Sharon will give you some figures on this. It's outrageous, frankly, it's outrageous. But the worst thing is they're not providing the support. for people. Now, I was shocked that we're experiencing this in London. Now, following my Homelessness Reduction Act, which was once again inspired by Crisis and others in 2016, which aimed to look after vulnerable people, this is the type of accommodation that vulnerable people often end up in. And they can be vulnerable because they're recovering from drug addiction, they may be previously street homeless, they could be fleeing domestic violence, they could be leaving prison, they could be leaving the armed forces, they could be leaving care from a local authority. And Southwark Council was one of the trailblazers in terms of implementing the Act, did a really good job in terms of helping and assisting, but they have a problem with this exempt accommodation, certainly. And recently, Inside Housing, and I would recommend colleagues that you look at the Inside Housing report, reported that 177 local authorities are paying out £883 million in housing benefit each year on this supported housing. But 100 local authorities who definitely have supported housing within their areas didn't respond to the FOIs. So we can say that more than £1 billion is going out in housing benefit. Now, we should be clear, there's an awful lot of really good providers who are doing a really good job in terms of providing housing for vulnerable people. There's also rogues who, frankly, as Jasmine said, are literally exploiting vulnerable people. And what we've got to do is make sure that we go down very hard on those rogue landlords, but not impact the good providers who, I think, you heard from the Deputy Mayor earlier that in terms of funding, this is quite a tight position in terms of the organisations that do a really good job in providing that service.
Well, thank you very much for that very comprehensive and succinct reply. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Assembly Member Cooper. Yeah.
Just before I come to you, sorry, I had a quick question, Mr. Blackman, which was just, and feel free to correct me if I've misinterpreted this. So the bill, some of its measures include, one of its measures includes looking at use classes for supported accommodation and
yes,
enhanced licensing. I just wonder what you think the impact of that might be on London.
Well, obviously at the moment, as you've heard, neither the GLA nor the boroughs have got the power to do anything about this if rogues set up within their areas. Now, once again, there is a clear need for people who are vulnerable to be provided with suitable housing and suitable support to rebuild their lives. And the good providers will assess someone when they arrive, see what support they require, and then make sure they provide it. The rogues literally will just provide accommodation and say, that's it, good luck, you're on your own. And someone may pop around and see you once a week and say, is everything okay? And then disappear. That is not helping and assisting supported people who are extremely vulnerable. The other issue, which I think is very important, and I haven't got the evidence for this in London yet, but I hope that your committee could actually try and seek this evidence out, that a lot of this supported housing has literally people who have, they may be recovering drug addicts, so drug pushers pop round to encourage them to renew their habit. They could be people fleeing domestic violence. They could be criminals who've left prison who have committed sexual offences. And others could all be accommodated in the same property without any controls whatsoever. And so it places people who are vulnerable in an extremely vulnerable position. Now, what we've got to do is make sure that those vulnerable people are supported and maintained in the type of accommodation and given the support. Now, in terms of what we're proposing, yes, there will be a required licensing process so that anyone who is setting up such a home or runs a home at the moment will need to get a license from the borough. That will have an impact straight away and will require boroughs to inspect and make sure that the accommodation is fit for purpose and that support is being provided. We've also put in there, and this is one of those areas where the debate is still going on, about whether local authorities should require planning permission for a change of use of a domestic property into a supported housing project. In my view, that gives local authorities control over both the quality and also the siting of supported housing units, because at the moment boroughs have no control over that whatsoever. And in Birmingham in particular, whole streets have been taken over by projects, which might be acceptable, but in most cases it means we're losing family houses, which are desperately needed in London, as we all know, for these type of projects. So from that perspective, there will be a permissive position whereby the Secretary of State can introduce that usage class at a future date if the licensing regime is not considered to be as effective as is required. But my worry slightly about licensing is obviously that is after the home is effectively being set up, and it doesn't allow a local authority to control the setting up by organisation. Now, the other thing obviously is making sure that the people who are setting up are fit and proper persons to be running such homes. We do know that, as Jasmine has said, in the worst cases, there are gang members involved, there are criminals involved who are exploiting these vulnerable people, because there are large amounts of money to be made from the enhanced housing benefit from the rentals. And I think this is one of the areas of concern, that those vulnerable people who can't often protest, and if they do protest, the landlords will say, I'm very sorry, but if you protest too much, you'll be out on the street, and you'll then be intentionally homeless, and you will have nowhere to live, and you'll be sleeping on the street. We've put in the bill a change to the intentionality on homelessness, so that if someone does leave a property on that basis, then the local authority will not be allowed to classify them as being intentionally homeless, and they will have to assist them.
Okay, thank you very much. Back to you, Assemblymember Cooper.
Thanks very much, Chair. So what I would like to know is, have you had conversation with the Mayor of London, or indeed the Deputy Mayor for Housing, who, as you pointed out, is with us today, and have you had support from them for the elements of your bill that are currently going through the House?
No, to be fair, this bill stems from the report that the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Committee conducted in our review, in our investigation this year. And obviously there are prime parts of the country, and I could mention obviously Birmingham. Blackpool has a very interesting scenario with what they're doing in terms of Article 4 directives to try and limit the spread of units which are unacceptable. Equally, a lot of coastal towns have got problems in this regard as well. But we haven't had conversations with London councils or the Deputy Mayor in particular. But I will welcome them, because one of the things I think here is that a lot of the rogue landlords are going to prey on properties where the value of the property is relatively low, so they can exploit the position in terms of housing benefit to the ultimate extent. Now, in London, as we know, property prices are much higher, and therefore it would be harder for such gangs to set up. But I think one of the problems here is the lack of data on the number of units that are being provided across the country, but in particular in London, for this purpose. And so the Levelling Up Housing and Communities Department hasn't had the data on this, and it's one of the reasons why we're having to tread reasonably carefully in terms of the legislation, because there will be several consultations after this bill becomes an act before the regulations are introduced, and of course the data is required in order to formulate those regulations.
Yeah, it's very obvious also that Jasmine Bastaran was also making the same point. I do wonder whether some of the data, some of the councils made this point to us, could be acquired not so much from the sources that you're talking about, but maybe from the DWP, because it sounded from the councils that they were saying that they didn't know that uncommissioned exempt accommodation was being set up in their borough, and then very large housing benefit claims were being made to them. And I'm just wondering if there might be some sort of link in there. You're talking about controls through licensing and potentially, if necessary, through planning. but the local authorities were saying that they, some of these road providers are using lawyers who send very threatening letters, and they find it very hard to refuse housing benefit claims, even though they feel that the support supplied is probably less than minimal, even though it should be more than minimal. Do you think that would be another line for you?
Yeah, I mean, we've got to look at two aspects to this. One is that the model is often one of a rental agreement and then the support that's provided. Often the commission support, as you will know, is provided by the local authority, and therefore the funding for that is quite clear. It's under a contract, and it's properly examined. The non-commissioned part is the bit that we really have to go after, because those are exactly as you say. We don't know who those people are. I've asked ministers to actually in DWP to look at this, because there's an awful lot of money going out of the system, and if local authorities are being threatened in terms of approving the housing benefit claims, which, as you say, and I think that's certainly true, then obviously they've got no choice but to pay up.
No.
Now, I've asked. In fact, only yesterday, I asked in the House for a review of this position on assessment, so that it shouldn't be the landlord sending in the claim on behalf of the client and then having the housing benefit assessed on that basis. Technically, it should really be the claimant sending this in. Now, some vulnerable people, as we know, will not be in a position to do this. So we've got to, once again, tread carefully, because I don't want to see people who are vulnerable not ending up with somewhere to live and without the support they need. But on the other hand, I don't want to see them exploited. So we need to make sure that the assessment of housing benefit and the need is of course being used in the right way. Technically, they shouldn't be using the housing benefit and the rental for the support that's provided.
No.
So from that perspective, often, and you'll see this when I'm sure Sharon will tell you about what happens, is that the individuals who are tenants have to find the support element of whatever they're being provided with from other benefits as they go through. But once again, this is a complete grey area where literally money is swirling around the system and being exploited. And what we want to do, I think, is make sure that we clamp down on this very hard.
Well, I think we're all on the same page with that. We had we had a couple of round tables, and we had some quite, dreadful evidence from both local authorities and some of the providers who are commission providers. But if I could just come back to the point about the mayors. Obviously, we've got the M10 group of regional mayors, and I just wondered if you think whether or not regional mayors should have any kind of role at regional level in the oversight of exempt accommodation. I think it's probably quite acute in London because we've got 32 boroughs in the city, so it's very fragmented. But the same applies, for example, to Greater Manchester, where you've got quite a number of different authorities brought together, the same in the sort of, the Birmingham area stretching beyond the immediate city. Do you think there's a role there for the regional mayors or, the bodies?
Yeah, there's clearly a role for the regional mayors, but it depends, because obviously all the various different devolution deals that have been done, which end up with regional mayors, have got different levels of responsibility, and some may exist with the local authorities, and some may exist with the regional mayors. So it's a complex position here. I do think, in particular, in what we're talking about here, is it's going to be a question of scale, because the licensing that we're proposing in the bill, obviously, if a local authority has only got one housing unit, we don't want a heavy bureaucracy to deal with one housing unit. But it might be that boroughs come together, and it might be, as you say, that the regional mayors put together the support and assistance to assist local authorities in controlling and licensing and approving and inspecting the wider area, which would give economies of scale. And we don't want to add levels of bureaucracy unnecessarily. And I think the other thing is that there will be, for a lot of local authorities in this country, they will have commissioned services. They will know the people that are running places, and they'll know that they're running well. If there's a need for improvement, well, there's existing regulators to do that. which is one of the reasons why I say that good providers should have nothing to fear from the legislation that we're putting through. The people we're after are the rogue landlords who resist completely interaction with local authorities because they don't want to accord with what should be decent standards, and they don't want to provide support to the individuals. Because actually, the other thing I just mentioned is there's a bizarre position here whereby, if someone starts to rebuild their lives and manages to get a job and starts earning money, then they start losing housing benefit. So the rogue landlords won't want that under any circumstances.
No,
And
which
in
obviously then blocks your route if you're in that kind of situation,
Exactly.
out of being, you effectively become trapped in supported housing. I guess the
Exactly.
point that I'm trying to get to with the idea that maybe it should be done on a more regional basis is that, do you think there might be a risk of different regulatory regimes being operated at local level? A compelling piece of evidence we heard was from Riverside, who operate all over the UK, and I think also now in Scotland. They have schemes from sort of Cornwall, Bristol, all the way up to Newcastle. And if you're operating in 150 different boroughs, you could then be interacting with 150 different regulatory licensing schemes. Do you think that could be a problem?
Well, it potentially could be a problem, but obviously that depends on the regulations that apply to the licensing arrangements. The view I have is there will be from the government and from Levelling Up Housing and Communities Department clear regulation and clear guidance over how such licensing arrangements should operate and how they should be set up. Where you've got providers who provide accommodation, literally all over England, the last thing we want to do is for them to be facing different licensing arrangements in different parts of the country. That doesn't make good sense from a provision. What we want to do is make sure that we get the type of regulation right and the type of licensing scheme correct. But what we don't want to do, and I'll come back to this, is have a position whereby a very relatively small local authority ends up putting a whole bureaucracy together for a few units. That just doesn't make sense at all, which is why a regional basis might be a more sensible route initially, and it might devolve down later if the number of units increases accordingly. Our problem is, and I come back to this, we don't have the data.
I know. I mean, that is a huge paucity of data, I think, was what Jasmine Basran referred to in her initial remarks. But as you say, obviously having an onerous scheme for local authorities, also smaller providers, how will your bill protect small services so that people who aren't, operating across 150 local authorities who perhaps have a much smaller capacity for additional regulatory requirements, but maybe providing a very, very tailored, very necessary service? Is that something that your bill will make sure that those providers aren't driven out of the market? Given we have also, as well as a paucity of data, I think it's obvious that we have a paucity of good quality accommodation.
Exactly. And clearly we don't want to drive out of the market people that are providing a good service for a small number of people, probably. Under this market, remember, these are supposed to be run by not-for-profit organisations. So they could be charities, they can be voluntary organisations, they could be all sorts of people. The problem is that the model, as it often works, is that the provider is a not-for-profit organisation, but the landlord is very much in the market of making money. And unfortunately, we have uncovered evidence of a position whereby the provider is a not-for-profit organisation with appropriate directors and such like. And funnily enough, they happen to also be the landlords of the property, but it's arm's length, and therefore the not-for-profit organisation rents the property from the landlord, who then charges exorbitant rent, and then it's justified to claim exorbitant housing benefit on the back of this. That is clearly exploiting loopholes in the system, and we've got to find a way within the regulation of making sure that sort of abuse is not continuing.
Thank you.
But I think it's key, as you say, that we don't want to affect these small organisations. Like there are many organisations we know that operate these type of services. We want to encourage those to continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blackman. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Assembly Member Devenish.
Good morning, Bob. Thank you so much for all you do in housing and elevating it up the political agenda. It's really appreciated. I know we're on a clock, otherwise I'd probably ask you what we can do to actually raise housing up, as it was a housing crisis that the 2016 election was very much centre stage. But I'll just stick to my question because I know we're running out of time. Maybe you can come back at another time, please. So my question this morning is, what funding will be available to local authorities to implement this legislation, please?
Well, one of the estimates from one of the local authorities we consulted came up with a figure of well over £500,000 to set up the necessary arrangements. The government, as part of the process of this legislation, have to come up with a money bill because it will cost money. They've got to do an assessment of how much the cost will be of implementing the legislation. And therefore, with new burdens, and these will be new burdens on local authorities, comes new money. Now, the challenge for us is to make sure that that money is sufficient to provide the support that local authorities will need to implement the legislation. Now, all I can say is that when we did the Homelessness Reduction Act, we managed to get £91 million out of the government for the implementation for the first year alone, and after that, obviously, we've had the pandemic, and there's been problems in respect of making sure that funding is available because we've had the Everyone In programme. But from my perspective, it's very important that this is properly resourced. Otherwise, it won't have any teeth. And so I will be lobbying very hard the Treasury to make sure we get sufficient funds so that local authorities can set up what we need.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you back in front of the committee next year. My resolution is to get housing far higher up the political agenda in 2023. Thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to do my evidence virtually, because I've got questions I could ask in health and social care questions a bit later on in the House.
Okay to take a couple more questions, or do you need to head
off?
Of
course. No, I don't need to go till a bit later, so I'm very happy to take any questions you've got.
For a minute, I thought that the reason you'd gone virtually is because you turned up at the old building that you were used to going to. But no, that's not.
I'd have got lost on the way, Andrew. I got lost on the way.
Perish the thought. You are a London Member of Parliament. So do you think the Mayor should develop a clearer pan-London map of supported housing stock and provision?
Well, I think it's one of the jobs of the Mayor and the GLA to make sure that we've got the data on what exactly is going on. Certain boroughs, and I would single out, for example, Newham, who've had licensing arrangements in place for quite a long time on the private sector housing. There are different views on this, but it's certainly a very, very bureaucratic arrangement, but very necessary. I think there needs to be an appropriate position whereby we have the proper data, because without the data and the knowledge of what exactly is going on, it's very difficult to implement either rules, regulations, legislation, and legislation in Parliament takes a very long time to take through. I mean, my legislation here, I hope it's going to receive all-party support. It has received all-party support thus far. I hope it's going to continue through the Lords and receive royal assent probably in April. But it'll be another 18 months before we get all the regulations that underpin the legislation actually into operation. In the meantime, these rogue landlords who are exploiting the system are going to be literally carrying on exploiting the system and exploiting some extremely vulnerable people. So without the data, it's very difficult to know what extent is needed in terms of regulation and what extra effort is required. So I think there's a massive job to be done in London to collect the data on this position. I do remember a survey when I was an Assembly member that we did on the private sector housing and the extent of it and what returns people, landlords were receiving in terms of private sector rentals. I think, that's the sort of role that's vitally important to guide government policy.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And you're almost proving what a lot of people say, that going from an Assembly member to an MP needn't be a demotion. You can still be useful. Thank you very much.
I have a final question for you before you leave, Bob. You said that you're going to be working on a cross-party basis to lobby for more support, and obviously a lot of that will be funding. Do you have, at this point, an idea of what scale that might be? And again, for our purposes, we're obviously interested in London, but it would be helpful if and when you have those numbers to understand what London needs.
Yeah, I'd love to have the data. I mean, one of the problems that you may appreciate when you're doing legislation as a private member's bill, as opposed to government legislation. Government legislation has, all the work of all the civil servants in the department. When you're doing a private member's bill, you have the support of. I'm very fortunate that I've got the support of my select committee colleagues, and also the clerks that assist us in the same way as you've got the support on your committee. I'm also fortunate to have the support of the government, but of course the government's got one or two other things, particularly the Levelling Up department has got a lot of things on their plate at the moment. And whilst I think Jasmine was commenting about Eddie Hughes and the excellent work he did when he was a minister on this particular area, we now have other things that are going on. There's the Renters Reform Bill, there's the Levelling Up Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. All these things are quite draining on the department in terms of their ability to do things. So, yes, if we've got data, then I'm very happy to share it with you. I think what is important is that we get good quality data. But if you're doing an inquiry, I think it would be very helpful in terms of your inquiry if you make recommendations on collecting information about what's going on in London and therefore on not only what is the current status on the ground, but also what the need is. Because only if you establish that can you then say, right, the resources that are required then flow from that amount of information.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. We're going to seamlessly move back to Assembly Member Baker and pick up where we left off.
I'm not sure I'm going to manage to segue very well. I'm just going to launch back in. Thanks. I've got a further question for you, Jasmine, about the standards of accommodation and support. I mean, obviously, you were talking about the really, really poor examples of exempt accommodation, and Bob Blackman also mentioned where there is very minimal support, just popping around like once a week. You're right, that's it. But in that context, what do you think? Obviously, there are different types of needs, but do you think there is a better standard that there can be put in for the levels of support that are required in exempt accommodation?
In short, yes, absolutely. One of the really key things that the Private Members Bill will bring in, if passed, is a consultation and a power for the Secretary of State to set national support standards. And that also is really important for that point earlier around the need for national consistency. So although I think what we see in this space is very, very poor support. So effectively, providers who have no intention of actually meeting the needs of their client group, that's not why they're there. They're there just to make a profit off the kind of exemptions to the caps on housing benefit. We also see providers who are there and are well-intentioned but may not be meeting the support of the clients that they have. And then we have very good provision who do everything they can to meet the client's support needs. So the consultation that will be carried out, and government have committed to carrying out this consultation, will be really important for shaping those national support standards, and particularly because there are different groups needed who are using this type of accommodation. So for us at Crisis, one of the main areas we see this for is meant to be transitional accommodation. It isn't in a lot of cases, but if we focus in on that type of support, the key things that we think would be needed are support to actually find a settled home as soon as possible, so people aren't staying in supported accommodation. We know at the moment in some areas people who don't need supported accommodation are also in exempt accommodation because there is such a lack of access and availability of mainstream affordable housing. We'd also like there needs to be an assessment of that person's needs as soon as they are kind of recognised as needing help, and therefore that support should be person-centred and tailored to meet that person's need. And the other kind of key element should be safety of the resident, but also others, if there are any risks posed to others, and referral pathways, so that local authorities are working with reputable providers to provide that support and working in partnership with them. And then, of course, the staff as well. There's a really key element here of needing to have staff properly trained, the resources to be able to do that, and for that support to be trauma-informed, because we certainly find that a lot of people who need supported housing have a history of trauma, and that's one of the reasons why they do find themselves in need of supported housing.
Thanks, that's really helpful, and as somebody who's not in the sector, that really brought it to life for me. Thanks, Chair.
Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I am now introducing Councillor Thompson and Guy Chaundy from Birmingham. I was just waiting to get them on the screen before I start firing questions at them. Be ready to unmute. Great. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for coming today. It's really good that you've been able to join us, to give us advice in London on an issue that I know you've experienced for some time and probably have good advice for us. So just to give you introductory question, starting with you, Councillor Thompson, what quality issues have you seen with exempt accommodation in Birmingham, and what problems with, we've heard them described as rogues already in this meeting, what problems with rogue landlords have you seen that you think we all need to be aware of in London?
Okay, so thank you for today. In answer to your question, I think the starting point in some of it we've heard from Jasmine and Bob is in terms of the quality that people are receiving, the lack of care and support, even though the standards say more than minimal. We've seen cases where people have had none whatsoever. We've had people tell us that they see this as predatory, and that's coming from people that are living within exempt accommodation. And through the inspections that we've done through the pilot, what we have seen is a number of properties that have category 1 and category 2 defects, hazards, which is really, that's quite shocking considering the type of a property that it is. When you start to speak to the individuals, you'll hear more cases. So I've had cases in my own ward where people have been without electric for 2 days because the support worker hasn't, in their words, topped up the electric. We've had people that have been put into houses which I would say aren't configured in the right way. So you might have someone that has been a vulnerable female that's in a house with men who then tell you that they've been passed around the house. So there's a whole range of issues that we have seen. But one of the starking things that we see, which wasn't part of the pilot, but we chose to do a scrutiny inquiry into, was the effects that it was having on local neighbourhoods because of the planning issues that are involved. So exempt accommodation is exempt from many planning laws, particularly those that are registered providers, the bigger ones. So we're seeing whole streets that have been changed, and it's no exaggeration to say that we've had individuals where, local people have not known if they're going to wake up with car windows because the level of vulnerability on the streets from different providers having different groups there. So you're seeing that developer providers will buy properties on the street, so it changes the whole makeup, it affects the housing value. There's a whole range of issues that take place, but one of the biggest concerns is definitely around the support, or the lack of support that we are seeing from providers, and their lack of concern about what it does to the local neighbourhood. I think that's been quite shocking as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chaundy. You're the officer, the assistant director for housing strategy and enabling. You presumably have to deal with these issues on a day-to-day basis. What have you done to tell us about the problems, first of all, but also how did you identify that these problems were coming from supported housing and uncommissioned, unregulated landlords in that kind of way?
Yeah, I think it first came to light when we started to see the extent of the growth. We had, up until about 4 years ago, we had a fairly stable provision in the city, between 14,000 units, and literally over the space of a couple of years that pretty much doubled, and we were seeing coming into the service the issues that you've heard today, and specifically the issues Councillor Thompson just mentioned about the impacts it was having on local neighbourhoods. So that was coming through local members raising issues around serious antisocial behaviour, environmental issues, and I think that was compounded, and I think Mr. Blackman referenced it, where we've got a high number of properties with these inappropriate mixes. So you've got a lot of people with very complex and multiple needs. That causes a problem in the property, but when you actually see 20 to 30 houses that are accommodating the same sort of problems in one road, that was raising real issues. And obviously that was compounded by the growth, as I say. So we moved from a position where we had 14,000 units. We're now at just over 23,000 units of accommodation. And although the pilots enabled us to get behind the door and to try and work with providers around directing them away from areas where we've got high saturation, it's been really difficult with the lack of powers that we've got outside of the housing benefit process to control that provision. What the pilots did enable us to do was to get behind the front door, if you like. We mobilised a multidisciplinary inspection team with that funding from Levelling Up, which included property inspectors, included adult social care social workers, it included community safety, and we had a seconded police officer in as well. So we've undertaken just under 2,000 units of inspections. Obviously still a lot more work to be done, but that enabled us to highlight some of the issues that Councillor Thompson said: high prevalence of statutory nuisance, clearly lack of support or no support being provided, etc., and all the things that you've heard so far today.
Okay, that's really, really useful to hear. Can I just ask, not as a side issue, but we represent Londoners, and we know that some of our residents may have ended up in your accommodation in Birmingham. Do you have any evidence of that, or any idea of the prevalence of this? Seeing as you said the amount of exempt accommodation in Birmingham has shot up, is that taking in people from other areas, including London?
Yeah, the out-of-city referrals, the evidence we've got is quite anecdotal, and it goes back to this debate about data. So there's not necessarily a requirement when you're sending in the housing benefit application to say where the person's come from. What we have been establishing through, and Councillor Thompson will come here, when we've spoken to other authorities, and recently we had a meeting at Homeless Partnership Board where Probation Service reported the fact that he had had conversations with other local authorities who were quite clearly open and saying, yeah, we refer to Birmingham because it's easy, because you've got all the accommodation there. So it's kind of exacerbated the problem, and it's fed the problem. And we have had anecdotal information that through the inspection work, that people are in accommodation. Yeah, it's the first time in Birmingham, they've just been sent there. Have no support network, have no knowledge of the local area. So this whole issue about how these out-of-city referrals are made is a critical one that we need to get on top of. And again, only anecdotal about London, and it is something that we do want to sort of continue with the ongoing pilot work about getting some more data and intelligence about how prevalent that is, and obviously still pushing for more national sort of protocols wrapped around how statutory referring agencies and local authorities referring to this non-commissioned and unregulated exempt accommodation. I don't know if Councillor Thompson, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in terms of Birmingham, we've done some analysis. So the actual Birmingham need is about 9,000 units, whereas we've got about 23,000 units. So a lot of that is coming from outside of the city. And as Guy said, there has been anecdotal evidence that there has been people being placed there from London and across the country. There's been, we've worked with some of the journalists who have done some work, and they've told us where they've seen advertisements as far as, I don't know, Isle of Wight, other places across the country, including London, that advertise bed spaces within Birmingham. And previously, when we first started the journey, I think we did have some form of, at least I will, because Guy won't say it, some form of issue with probation service in relation to them releasing people from prisons and sending them straight to Birmingham, with them not having any links, as Guy said, to the local area. So there is definitely anecdotal evidence. But again, I think this goes back to Bob's point, is the fact that there is an absolute lack of data and not always asking the right questions to enable local authorities to be able to understand the actual, the market that's within their areas.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So on to solutions and actions that you've taken. Obviously, the bill has not gone through yet. You haven't got additional powers. There's not additional funding for you. But you've outlined a whole load of issues there, from serious health hazards in the homes to exploitation. You've talked about antisocial behaviour. Can you run quickly through the things that you've done that have been effective in tackling the problems, maybe not at source, but in the community?
So do you want me to take that one first, or?
Yeah, you start and I'll jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it was the pilot that gave us some of the, well, gave us the funding to mobilise the resources to do some of the positive work. Whilst that included the inspection activity, it also enabled us to do a lot of other things. So we've obviously undertook the needs assessment, so that we've got a real clear picture of what the need is in the city and also what the provision looks like. We've just taken through our cabinet a supported housing strategy moving forward, heavily predicated on the need for some of that regulatory change that we've talked about. But I think the key piece, and it was alluded to earlier, was us introducing our own accreditation scheme in the city. So our quality standards is an accreditation scheme where providers, it's voluntary, but we've got somewhere in the region of 30 to 35 providers going through this process at the moment, where they pay a subscription, they get assessed against Birmingham's quality standard, which is, it kind of builds on the national statement of expectations in terms of what we want to see as a quality standard in Birmingham. They get assessed and they're given a Kite Mark award. And what that enables us to do then is to the referring agencies that we know operate in the city, certainly the statutory ones, we direct them through those providers that are being accredited. Running alongside that, something called the Charter of Rights, which is very much aimed at the individual tenants and those living in exempt accommodation. And this was developed using people with lived experience to try and understand the issues and to set some principles about what people live in this accommodation should expect in terms of a right to feeling safe, a right to a decent home, and a right to be able to raise concerns and how they can raise concerns if they do have any. And we've got over 100 providers now signed up to that. We're just moving into sort of the next sort of phase. We've got some additional funding. We've developed a training program which we're going to roll out to providers about what good looks like and what their responsibilities are around safeguarding support provision. But as you've alluded to, a lot of this is kind of voluntary based. There's no requirement. So through either a licensing or an accreditation scheme, I think that's kind of the key things that I think will help drive up some of the quality issues. Councillor Thompson, I don't know if you want to add to that.
The only things I would add to that, Guy, is just we've also looked at providing some level of training for some of the providers and their staff, because the aim is really to either raise the standard or we think you need to exit. So helping them with the training is a good way of raising the standards. We have an exempt accommodation forum, which is made up of residents groups, so individuals representing different residents groups, so they give us a lot of insights. They've also done a lot of research, so they've done national research for us, and have challenged us actually on some of our processes, and we run the strategy, we ran that by them before we are taking it to Cabinet. I think the other thing I would say in addition to that is also making sure that we strengthen the relationship with the regulator. So there's regular meetings that take place with the regulator now, and we exchange information. That has helped to lead to at least 2 to 3 providers actually coming out of the market because they were not providing adequate care and support, which did have a huge impact on us. And one of the things that any local authority will worry about is about if a provider does fall out of the system in terms of stop provision, what happens with the people that are living within that provision. So we've also made sure that as part of our strategy, it includes a decommissioning strategy. And I think the final thing I would say is also people move, organisations go to where they think there's properties. So we're also speaking across the region because I chair the homelessness group of cabinet members for across the region in the West Midlands, cross-party. So we're looking at analysis across the whole region to see what the impact of, if we improve things in Birmingham, does that have a knock-on effect to other local authority areas? And just on the Charter of Rights, just to say that that has actually been co-produced with 50 people who have actually lived within exempt accommodation to make sure that we are getting things right from their perspective.
That's great. I mean, that Charter of Rights sounds like a really positive step as well, just helping people to know what they can expect and to be able to stand up and say this is wrong and know where to come was one of the issues that came out of our round table, I think. Can I just ask quickly, you talked about working with different groups and the regulator and people across the region there. Are you also talking to the smaller providers, the specialist by and for providers who we talked about a bit ago, who might struggle with new regulation because they are quite grassroots but also trustworthy? They're the sorts of people we like to encourage, but are you working with them as well to make sure that they're not affected by the measures you're taking?
Yes, so what we have done is we've made sure that we've tried to reach out to as many different groups as possible. So the smaller providers as well as the larger providers. A few months ago, we facilitated a national conference on exempt accommodation with over 240 people that attended, despite the rail strike. And that meant that we could also have breakout sessions that was a bit more tailored to the needs of those individual groups, which was really important. The other key thing to say is Birmingham has worked with the other pilot areas on the pilot scheme that was run nationally, and we have spoken to a number of authorities across the country, different types of providers. We've worked with the LGA, and we've worked with politicians, we've worked with third sector, including Crisis and Commonweal and other people, because we've got a wish list of things that we think need to be changed nationally in terms of legislation, and to help us across the board, not just in Birmingham, but the country. But we wanted to make sure that what we were saying didn't have a negative adverse effect on those that are providing good provision in the sector or are smaller organisations, because we wouldn't want to price them out of the sector or over-regulate them in a way that they can no longer function. So we've made sure that we took a really good approach to that. And our scrutiny committee, the report that was produced, that really helped us to do that real good grounding, reach out and collection of data and evidence.
Okay, and just to follow up on what you said about sort of sanctions and the different problems that there were, really glad to see you talked about having a decommissioning strategy, i.e. if a place needs to be shut down and people need to be moved out because it's dangerous or because the landlord needs to be taken out of that system, that you've got somewhere to put them. Have you got any data on the different sanctions that you've implemented against people who were rogue landlords or people operating unsafe properties, that you could maybe send to us? It'd be interesting to know, out of all those properties that there were, what proportion needed that sanction. You've probably got the best data set there is, I think.
So what we do have as part of the pilot activity through the housing benefit team, we introduced a review process, a more stringent gateway initially, but also a review process, which has obviously led to claims being refused because they've been unable to evidence, or we've been out and seen that they're not providing support, etc. So we've got the statistics on and how much housing benefit or how many claims we've actually cancelled. In terms of providers moving out of the sector, Councillor Thompson alluded to 2 or 3 large providers, and they were fairly large, that it was their own decision really was to exit the market because they felt that they weren't able to deliver what we wanted them to deliver, and obviously some of the margins that they operate in was making it very difficult. In addition to that, obviously some of the more serious problems, we've had a number of closure orders. So we've worked with the police on 2, I think it is now, largest schemes where we've literally had to go down the route of closure orders. And the exit toolkit has enabled us to kind of make sure it's basically a kind of a protocol, if you like, about how agencies come together to make sure that we don't see any fallout in terms of homelessness, that people are accommodated to other providers, or that we're dealing with them through our statutory processes.
Okay, thank you. And then you talked about working with the police there, and the amount of money that Bob Blackman was talking about that seems to be flowing through into the system is enormous. I mean, this constitutes essentially fraud, doesn't it? Are you, as the best area working on this, are you working towards prosecutions on that sort of level?
Well, on the fraud, so we do sort of, again, through our housing benefit team, work with DWP fraud. So where we do find that it's more than just an oversight, that there is more. So we refer through to DWP fraud. On the police issue, we've, as I say, we seconded in a police sergeant as part of the first pilot, because what we found was quite early on was a lack of join up in terms of intelligence and data. So where we were seeing there was like pretty serious antisocial behaviour, what we didn't know was what was beneath that. So what the police resource enabled us to do was to tap into police intelligence on individuals, and actually that established that there were clear links to some of that more organised criminal activity, whether that's around drug dealing, prostitution. We've got some case studies that we provided through the select committee, which kind of highlighted the seriousness of some of those, including, you know, finding firearms and things like that. It was really bad. Just on the money side, just to sort of highlight the fact of how much Birmingham's an outlier. So Mr. Blackman talked about over 800 million. Birmingham's HB bill is almost half of that. So it's between 350 and 400 million pounds a year that's going out through housing benefit in Birmingham alone.
Wow, that's a lot. And just to be clear, when you said serious organised offences and firearms, you are saying that the landlords, the people owning the buildings, were potentially implicated in that, or are you just talking about residents?
Potentially, yes. On that case study, it was the so the model in Birmingham is very much it's housing associations predominantly, and they use managing agents, and they basically lease in property portfolio holders who then kind of manage the property and deliver the support. So those cases were linked to those particular landlords and agents. But as we've said, you know, we've got people that are you know, coming out of the criminal justice system, and the prevalence of that is, you know, so we've only got behind the door of just under 2,000 units, so there's still a lot more to do. But the prevalence of those sorts of issues are fairly clear.
Wow, so that's incredibly serious. Thank you for sharing that with us. And then just finally, to avoid all of this in London, and potentially we are already seeing some of this more in London, what lessons can we learn to get ahead of this in our city?
I think I'd start off by saying, I mean, Birmingham is an outlier in terms of the numbers, and we have we really have raised the profile on the issues around exempt accommodation across the country. So for a lot of the time, people thought it was just a Birmingham issue, and thankfully, the Select Committee evidence shows that it's much wider scale than that. I would say you do have a problem in London. I've been contacted by people from London. I've met with cabinet members within London, and we've had conversations. And the starting point was very much where we was in Birmingham when we first started on this journey, was that we thought we had a HMO problem. So we thought it was about the private rented sector, and that was what we thought it was. And when you started to ask more questions about the type of people living in there, that's when it became more obvious that actually it's an exempt accommodation problem that you've got with maybe a few rogue landlords or landlords that are evading their responsibilities or naively. One of the key things I would say is the first place to go to is always your housing benefit teams. Because that's where the entry point is for a local authority, and there has to be some matching up of a cross-directorate matching up within local authorities, because part of the problem was that it was looked at through a housing benefit lens because that was the council's statutory responsibility around it, and it bypassed everywhere else unless there was an urgent problem. So I would definitely say that there needs to be some research and some data analysis around through the housing benefit teams, and then also looking at who are the key providers within those particular boroughs. In Birmingham, I think the 6 biggest providers across the city are the ones that have had notices from the regulator for non-compliance. So it's about making sure you also build that strong relationship with the regulator to look at some of the issues across the city. And definitely it's been beneficial for us to speak to other local authorities across our region through the combined authority on the basis of people and organisations will move and go to where they think it's easiest.
Thank you. Yes, that's definitely an issue within London, and potentially why we might have follow-up questions for the Deputy Mayor about doing more on a pan-London level. I'll pass that back to you though, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Guy and Sharon. And we're going to take a little break here for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to the final section for questions to Tom and Jasmine. We'll pick up where we left off. So, Assembly Member Boff, please.
Thank you, Chair. We are on the last legs, don't worry. I've always been on my last legs, but still, that's another issue. I found all the evidence that we got from Birmingham actually fascinating, and I'm sure you took something out of that. This committee undertook roundtables with boroughs and providers to establish if the issues seen in Birmingham are also taking place in London. And we were shocked as a committee to hear of the road providers operating right across the capital, charging up to £700 a week and delivering little and indeed no support. And we also heard of homicides, vulnerable domestic abuse survivors and care leavers being placed with men, and desperate local authorities without the power to shut this housing down. Do you think the GLA has done enough to understand what is happening in London, and what more will it do you think?
Thank you. Well, I agree with you. It was very interesting and very concerning to hear from Councillor Thompson. And one of the things I thought was interesting about what she said was that they thought they had an HMO problem and a PRS problem. Yeah. And then when they dug deeper, they found it was an exempt accommodation issue. And I'm thinking back to when I was a councillor on the Risham Council. And in the 3 southern wards, there were family homes being snapped up at a rapid rate, as Bob Blackman was talking about, being converted into, single room TA units. And, I remember at the time it was considered to be an HMO issue. I'm now wondering whether or not it was also an exempt accommodation issue. I do think that, and if you heard Councillor Thompson's suggestions, obviously, the key one relating to, look at your, go to your housing benefits office. Obviously, the GLA does not have that function. So to some degree, I think the kind of, the evidence gathering and the data needs to be at a local level. Certainly, any exempt accommodation that is funded by the GLA is with registered providers. And any revenue funding and support funding that we give is closely monitored and contracted very, very carefully. There's definitely a need for more national regulation. I fully support Bob Blackman's bill, but with the obvious caveat, and I think Assemblymember Devonish raised this with him, that if you're going to put new duties onto local authorities, you've got to make sure that they're adequately funded to deliver on those duties. Landlord licensing more broadly as a London-wide thing is something that the Mayor has been calling for. I think there's great merit in having a licensing system applying to exempt accommodation as well. And that will help with the data, because it will help identify the properties that are registered, and then it will help the councils go with their enforcement powers after those who have failed to register, which we can probably assume in many cases will be the bad actors.
So do you consider that the GLA itself has a role in lobbying for those powers? And that's certainly something that we heard from housing providers and from the boroughs. So
I absolutely agree. We already obviously are lobbying for landlord licensing powers. I would be keen, subject obviously to the resourcing being put in place, and that would have to be an element of that. I would want us to be supportive of what Mr. Blackman is proposing, because I think this is definitely an area that needs more scrutiny.
Sure. I think from our previous sessions, it was fairly clear that I think that you're pushing an open door with the boroughs if the GLA were to take up that kind of coordinating role. Is that something that you consider?
I certainly consider. I think that one of the GLA's great strengths is its ability to convene.
Yeah.
And obviously, I would want to discuss with London councils as well and make sure we weren't we were all on the same page, of course.
So, do you think that the GLA, because of its strategic nature, perhaps, and we're well aware that we can't the GLA can't regulate in this area. There are a number of areas where it would be helpful if the GLA could come up with something like a strategy to prevent, for example, as we heard from Harrow. Yes. Yeah. As we heard from Harrow, where they had situations where there were actually 2 homicides. Was it Havering?
Was it Havering?
It was an H. Too many boroughs begin with H. So it was Havering saying that they'd actually got 2 homicides as a result of within their supported accommodation. Is there anything the GLA could do in that area that you think would have a role in trying to prevent such abuse in the future?
It's difficult because of the lack of regulatory powers. Obviously, it's something I can pick up with MOPAC. I think it comes back as well. I obviously I don't know the specifics of the case, but I would presume that this was in non-commissioned exempt accommodation would be my assumption. Am I right in that, or is that an unknown?
It was non-commissioned.
Non-commissioned. Just going back to the point I was making earlier about revenue funding, one of the reasons why non-commissioned accommodation, that there's been a growth in it, is because of the lack of revenue funding for local authorities to be able to provide proper commissioned services. So, I mean, part of the lobbying that we're doing to get more revenue funding should hopefully help to try and stamp out some of this non-commissioned accommodation. As I say, I can talk to MOPAC colleagues, but I think it's very difficult for us, with no regulatory powers over the sector, to be able to sort of make those interventions at a local level. I think if there was some sort of licensing scheme as envisaged in the bill, that would help local authorities to be able to take action. And obviously we would want them to be working in conjunction with the Met Police and with MOPAC.
Thank you very much. Pretty much you've answered most of the questions I had, and there were loads, but you've answered them before.
Thank you.
Yeah. If I could ask a follow-up question, though, one of the things that was mentioned by Birmingham was the use of police intelligence. I think particularly where you've got people who are vulnerable, maybe ex-offenders, people with drug problems, the antisocial behaviour that was mentioned. I know that the police have been doing some quite useful work recently, going out and investigating burglaries, using their intelligence and actually arresting and convicting people. I know this is not your area of responsibility as Deputy Mayor, but I wonder whether it might be worth asking you to go and speak with the Deputy Mayor for Policing about the potential to use police intelligence to maybe get a handle on where the worst of these problems may be. We certainly heard about homicides from some of the local authorities there due to the extreme risks that are going on in some of these buildings. And you'd think this would show up in police reports in some way and potentially could be looked at.
Yeah, I'm very, very happy to do that, and some of my team will be listening in, and I think it might be good for them to talk to colleagues in MOPAC as well about whether or not there's more that can be done jointly between GLA, MOPAC, Met Police in this area where there are terrible issues like we've just heard.
Just before I move on to the next person, so as today's conversation has progressed, and feel free, this is for both of you, we have a situation where there are clearly bad actors in the sector who are providing non-commissioned accommodation, but that has been caused in no small part because registered providers have withdrawn from the sector for financial reasons. And so it's difficult at this stage to see how that gap will be filled by anybody but those rogue actors who see a widening gap in the market to fill that need that boroughs have. I wonder, yes, we can't regulate, and your role, the GLA's role in the housing space is to increase supply and not to impose sanctions necessarily. So I just wonder, so that your comment earlier about the incentive would be to provide additional funding, but if those people don't want to build those units in the first place, what do we do?
But I think this speaks to the sort of intensive work that our specialist and supported housing team is doing with providers at the moment, precisely to try and get them back into this space. For some of the larger providers, there's a particular challenge because for them to get back in, because they've lost the institutional knowledge and the expertise. But we, as I said, I think I said earlier, want to try and lead the horse to water. We want to do what we can using our funding levers, using our convening powers, using our planning policies to increase uptake in this area. And it's partly as well making sure that we are advertising, in the brightest kind of lights possible. That it's not just general needs housing that we're funding, it is specialist housing, and making sure that we are shouting as loudly as possible, which is why I think the summit that we had last week was really important, and why this intensive work more broadly is really important as well. And obviously we keep pushing to get the revenue funding, which I think would be key to unlocking this.
Thank you. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Jasmine.
Just to add briefly, I think one of the points that Councillor Thompson made around a decommissioning strategy is really important here, and potentially something that should be considered. And the other point, just to come back to previous conversations, is that some of the need being met by this supported housing isn't best met by this type of provision. So we would really like to see the Mayor to continue to push for more investment in social housing, but also the local housing allowance rate and reform of the benefit cap, where those things are preventing immediate access into more settled housing in the private rented sector, for example. And we'd also like to see a continued support for the expansion of Housing First and more specialised supported housing, because there are tenants and residents in supported housing whose needs would be better met by Housing First provision, but because that provision isn't there, it are also kind of being absorbed by the sector. So there's many different levers, I think, that need to be pulled to really kind of sort out this situation.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. I think to a certain degree, actually, Jasmine has covered it. We've jumped around a lot in our questions before, but not just the Mayor. What would you like to see being done by the Mayor, by government, by local authorities to really start to address the issues that we've been exploring so thoroughly today and in the previous sessions that we had?
I think the bigger picture on all of this is the two key drivers of this situation are the lack of dedicated funding for support services, which has really been, over the last kind of decades, eroded. And we're seeing this borne out now in the problems we're seeing in the exempt accommodation sector and the lack of access to general mainstream housing. There is a really important role that supported housing plays, and we need to recognise that. And the funding, we've talked a lot about the money going into the sector. That money is also being used to make sure that people with high support needs are being met. And so we can't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to make sure that supported housing is also functioning as it should. But there's a wider kind of more strategic look needed here for better access to general mainstream housing and flexible support and funding for that support so that people's needs can be met and people aren't being institutionalized in a system that isn't actually meeting their needs. So I think those two really significant drivers need to be considered. And then at a local level, we do want to see local authorities, as you're starting here today, looking at what's happening in their local area and maybe unpicking some of the issues like Councillor Thompson referred to, where you might think it's a HMO problem, but it's actually an exempt accommodation problem. There will be consultation if the bill passes, and so we really hope that local authorities can be feeding into that and really shaping what some of this looks like so that they have the powers they need and can learn from the supported housing pilots and the learning's there, so that when the bill comes in, they can use those powers effectively and know how to kind of tackle this issue.
So if we go back over the past a bit, where we used to have the very specific grant money that used to come in for the supported housing sector, which for a long time was dealt with through the Department of the Environment Hostel Deficit Grant, as it was called then, unbelievably, and that then moved on to being Transitional Supported Housing Management Grant, Supported Housing Management Grant, and then became Supported People money, and the ring fence was removed, and we now find ourselves in this situation. Would you be in favour of having a revenue support grant of some description or another, which, and also we went through the whole thing about the support had to be floating so the person could stay in that dwelling and the support would float off somewhere else. But, you know, as it's turned out, the money, the revenue funding has floated off, and now we have this group of people who are perhaps being left by society in a really vulnerable situation, often in the private renter sector or what looks like an HMO, and that can leave them in literal physical danger. Do you think maybe we need to be rethinking the progress, the arc that we've gone through over time on this?
Yes, I would say we do, and we would support some form of revenue grant funding for support services.
That's ring-fenced from other, because I mean a lot of local authorities ended up administering supporting people funding, and of course a lot of that has then gone into older persons, which I'm not saying is an area that doesn't need funding as well, but it has left this group of people who are largely, there is no further revenue support, hence the G15 deciding that they want to pull out and so on.
Yes, ring-fenced.
Yeah, ring-fenced. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, do you have any further questions?
Sorry, Chair.
Go.
I was just wondering to Ms. Bazran, to what extent is move-on accommodation, more move-on accommodation, would that be helpful?
Sorry, could you repeat the question in terms of the support funding?
Yes, would more move-on accommodation be resolve some of these issues?
So the way at Crisis we see this working in terms of best practice is often this model of having people in kind of move-on accommodation for temporary periods of time. It can sometimes actually undermine that move on, because being in 2-year accommodation is also being in flux. So what we think the key measures need to be in place are needs assessment to understand what needs people have that need to be met and where they're best placed to meet that. So if it is in supported housing for a period of time and transitional, because that there is an intensive period of support needed, then that should be provided. But for some people, it will be actually access to mainstream housing, and it's the funding for support in place that will make the difference of sustaining that tenancy and then being able to kind of have that place as a settled and secure home. So what we see often is the best way to do this is to help somebody into somewhere that can be seen as a home longer term, and that provides that foundation where they're then able to build kind of this, engage in support and build the kind of skills and confidence they might need to then enter work or kind of thrive as we would expect everyone else. So that's the longer term vision we would like to see here. The move on support we have and accommodation we've seen in response to the pandemics, the rough sleep accommodation program has been absolutely vital, and I think we can't lose that. But in the longer term, we want to actually see those periods of support being shorter and people being moved into longer term housing with access to flexible support.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Devenish.
Well, my question just for the Deputy Mayor to finish, and next year's a great year because there's no elections, touch wood, in London, so we all have a bit more time. So I wondered whether you consider hosting a summit to try and get into the real granular detail of what we've been discussing today with Bob Blackman and other parliamentarians cross-party to see if we can actually move forward on some of these really, really difficult issues.
Well, as I mentioned, we've just had a summit with providers. If there is, if you think there would be benefit to us doing something with Mr. Blackman and others, I'm happy to look at that. It might be something that the Assembly wishes to host, and I'd be happy to come along to it. But let's consider it.
Thank you. And so I do have one final question for both of you, and I don't know if Guy and Sharon may have thoughts on this, but My question to you, Tom, is would the GLA consider implementing measures as seen in Birmingham? And to Jasmine, Sharon and Guy, of those measures that have been, if you like, piloted or looked at, what would you suggest for London to avoid a bigger issue in the future?
So what I would say to that is a lot of what I heard from Councillor Thompson and Guy was that these are things that are within the power of local authorities, for example, local councils. For example, the Housing Benefit Office, we don't have one, so that's not something that we can do. I think the point that was made about police intelligence is something that the GLA potentially we can look at. But I think a lot of what was discussed applies to local councils rather than to a strategic authority. But of course, we will seek to do whatever we can with the powers and the funding levers that we've got to try and make improvements in the sector, and to use our convening power and the mayor's convening power where it could help to encourage best practice, pan London, if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
I think one of the key learnings is identifying where this is problematic provision, and that is going to be really key to understanding this, and also looking at the learnings from Birmingham and also other local authorities that took part in the supported housing pilots in the way they manage the gateway to exempt accommodation. So, for example, as well as Birmingham, there's some really good practice in Hull about how they've identified and started encouraging better practice in this space. And I think the learnings across all the pilots will be really important because the kind of situation is different. All those areas are really different, and yet they all have an issue with exempt accommodation. So looking at how they manage that gateway, I think, is really important.
Thank you. And then over to our virtual guests, Councillor Thompson and Guy. Should we start with Councillor Thompson? Could you hear me?
It's on mute. I think there's a role to play in terms of helping with the research and the data and the coordination, because that's absolutely critical, and bringing together some of those strategic partners, particularly. And I wouldn't just say the police. The police have been really good because in terms of the West Midlands, because they gave a lot of evidence at the select committee, they were a part of the picture. But another place is also with the ambulance service, because they will have a lot of call outs, and actually that's the one area where there is the least amount of data. Because they get called to a house, they don't know if it's exempt, they don't know if it's a HMO. So I think there's definitely something around the data and the coordination, and that's absolutely critical, being able to coordinate amongst local authorities, and we've been able to do that quite well on the regional basis. And again, I also think in terms of strengthening the relationship with the regulator for social housing in this particular area. And also I would absolutely recommend working with large charities such as Crisis have done an incredible amount of work in this particular area on the policy function of it all. So those would be the key things that I would suggest.
Thank you. Anything to add, Guy?
I think primarily covered all the key things. I'm not sure if any of the boroughs have put bids in for the supported housing improvement programme, the levelling up programme, which will allow sort of to bring in funding to start bringing some of these things together, and just extend an invitation if there are boroughs that are going through that process. Quite happy to talk to them about learning from the pilots. But I think the things that we've talked about, doing a proper needs assessment, understanding what the need is, understanding what the current provision is, looking at any opportunities around establishing some form of quality standard or a consistent standard of quality about what your providers can accept, and getting that promoted and getting them trained on it. Those are some of the potential quick wins, I think.
Okay, I think from memory, when we spoke to boroughs here, none of them had been successful in getting that funding. So I'm sure that some of them would appreciate speaking to you to find out where they could perhaps learn from where you've been successful, and others as well. But I don't think any London boroughs are successful.
Right,
but that's a conversation for another day, and the levelling up department. So I want to thank all of our guests today for your contributions. It's been a really, really informative and insightful session. So can we, as a committee, note the report in today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Can we note our work programme and the additional activity undertaken since our last meeting, the informal roundtable sessions on supported housing? The date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 1st of February 2023 at 10 a.m. in committee rooms 2 and 3 at City Hall. I have no urgent business and I therefore declare this meeting to be closed. Thank you.